All right, so we continue our study of the Moreh Nevuchim now with part 2, chapter 4, which in the Pines edition is page 255. The what Rambam has laid down so far was the Aristotelean idea of the spheres, and the Aristotelean the premises upon which Aristotle came to the conclusions that there is a there is a first cause, that there is a creator, and the other primary ideas. In chapter 4, the Rambam is going to tell us about the idea that the spheres, right, have a soul. And I know that sounds like a strange notion for a moment, and Rambam recognizes that sounds like a strange notion. So he's going to explain that and what it means and why that's important. Now, I sent out an article today because it addresses an issue that I think is really important as we learn this. Because one of the things that all of us who have even a small amount of education in modern physics and science know, that we no longer look at the world in this way, right? Obviously we look at the world in a completely, our physics are completely different. We have a vast universe with a vast amount of empty space, and with galaxies and stars and solar systems. And in our solar system, there's a sun, and the Earth revolves around the sun, and so on and so forth. The forces that keep things together or pull things apart, or we think about the forces of gravity, we think about electromagnetic force, we think about electrons and protons. We think about the world in a completely different way. So one of the things that we're gonna, as the Rambam continues to lay out this Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian understanding of the cosmos and astronomy and so on, and then he's going to show how it's compatible with the Torah. So one of the things that someone might think, or most of us probably do think, is how does this help me, right? If the Rambam is going to tell me that when it says, and he's going to say this, that the soul that makes the sphere move is what the Torah means when it says an angel, right? Well, how does that, I mean, when I look at that today, I wonder, like what do you mean? I mean, there is no such thing as a sphere. These spheres have been disproven with a long time ago, and if that's an angel, then there's no such thing as angels. It all doesn't work, right? It doesn't seem to make sense. So you start to think that what the Rambam is saying is not relevant to me in 2023. But the point of the article I sent out was to demonstrate that through numerous proofs in the article, and it's worth looking at, by Menachem Kellner, that shows how clear it is that the Rambam understood, even though he was under the impression that the physics that he knew was basically what needed to be known, was the truth and the way it is, right? Because of what had been proven up to his time. He definitely also understood that it doesn't necessarily need to be the case, that as science advances, that they didn't have the same concept that we have today of the advancement of scientific knowledge, but it's still definitely true, and the article demonstrates how it's true, that the Rambam understood that many of the ideas that he had in his time may at some point be disproven, and there will be other ways of understanding, so that when you and I learn how the Rambam applies his science to his understanding of Torah, it will very much be relevant, because today we would then do the same kind of project. We would say, well, now that I know reality is like this, so now I know the Torah must be referring to this, right? The bottom line is seeking the truth, and the truth is what matters. And this is what why I sent the article out, and I think it's a good read. It's not too long, and it's worth reading. But now that we've said that, let's go into chapter 4. And I'm going to read from the Pines translation on page 255. That the sphere is endowed with a soul is clear upon reflection. So now you have these spheres. Now I'm just going to remind you, right? There's 10 spheres, right? Those 10 spheres are the first sphere that's closest to Earth is the sphere of the moon, the sphere of the sun, the sphere of Mercury, the sphere of Venus, the sphere of Mars, the sphere of Jupiter, the sphere of Saturn. Those were the ones that were visible to them in those days, right? What did I say? I said the moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn. I think I'm missing something. Mars, right? I skipped one, so that's 7, right? And then there's 3 outer spheres, which include all the other stars and account for the motions of the other stars. And then above that, right? So that's which would be 10. And then above that is the realm of the deity, the first God, the realm of heaven. That's how Aristotle viewed the world. And each of those spheres is moving around, and the outer sphere moving and causing the sphere below it to move, and so on and so forth. So that God rules from the outside of all of this, and makes the outer one move, through which the next one moves, through which the next one moves, until we get down to earth, through which the force of the movement of the sphere causes the elements in the world to mix around in certain ways, right? So that it creates the beings and the creatures that we see on this earth. That's how Aristotle viewed physics, okay? The thing is, though, is that if you and I think to ourselves, now, if we're going to try to think how things move, how do we move, right? So it usually starts with a thought, right? I decide that I want to get a glass of water, right? So I think about it, where am I going to get water? Oh, I got cold water in my fridge. So I stand up, I walk to my fridge, right? So how did that all happen? It's because a thought occurred in my brain that I'm thirsty, I need water, so therefore I made movement happen, okay? So think about that for a minute. So a philosopher in those days is going to look at the world in this way as well, right? So bear that in mind for a second, and let's continue the sentence here. However, he who hears this may deem this a matter that is difficult to grasp. Like, what do you mean when you say the spheres have a soul? What does that mean? Right? He may regard it as impossible, because he thinks when it says endowed with a soul, you're thinking like a soul of a man or an ass or a bull, right? You know, a soul that thinks and decides, do I turn this way? Do I turn that way? Do I go up? Do I go down? Etc. Now, this is not the meaning of that dictum. When I say that it has a soul, I don't mean that it's the same thing as the soul that you or I have, right? But rather what I mean is that the local motion of the sphere, the fact that the sphere moves, is a proof of there indubitably being in it a principle in virtue of which it is moved. Something in that sphere is making that sphere move, is making it decide to move forward, right? Or backward, or whatever direction. In this case, it's circular motion. And this principle is undoubtedly and incontestably a soul. It's definitely some sort of intellect. Remember, this is Aristotelean physics, right? In physics, Aristotle assumed, right, and Rambam is taking that assumption, that if the spheres move, there must be some sort of an intellectual process going on in that sphere that thinks, okay, I'm going to move. I'm going to go round and round, right? In this direction or that direction, or at this speed or at that speed, okay? This may be explained as follows. It is absurd that the circular motion of the sphere should be similar to the rectilinear motion of the stone downwards, or to the motion of fire upwards. In those days, part of Aristotelian physics was that certain things have natural motion, right? So that Earth, for example, or personified by a rock, naturally goes downward. Fire, which is a second of the 4 elements, naturally goes upward, right? Okay. So that's the natural motion of that particular element. Remember, there's 4 elements in this worldview, right? So that the principle of motion would be a nature and not a soul. So the rock doesn't have an intelligence that tells it to go down. It's just a thing that naturally goes downward. Remember, this is before they understood the idea of gravity. It was before Newton got bonked on the head with an apple, right? So for what is moved in natural motion is only moved by the principle subsisting in it, right? It's the principle of the rock is to go down, right? When the object to be moved is not in its place, and it is moved in order that it may seek to come to its place. The rock's place is in the earth, so it's constantly going downwards towards it. That's its natural motion. However, when the object reaches its place, it stops moving. It comes to rest because it no longer needs to move naturally, because it's now where it belongs. Right. However, when the object, the sphere, on the other hand, is moved in a circular motion, right? So therefore, it does not follow from the fact that the sphere is likewise endowed with a soul that it should be in motion in such a way, right? for every being endowed with a soul moves because of a certain nature or because of a mental representation. If things move, it has to be either because it's its nature to move or because there is some mental idea, some consciousness that says, I'm going to move this way, right? When I say here the expression nature, right, the seeking to attain what agrees with one and the flight from what disagrees, right? In other words, when I choose to move forward, it's to get the glass of water, it's because I'm thirsty, so I want to get water. Or I might say, I want to leave this room because it's too hot in here. I want to move to that room because it's nice and cool in there. Now, it makes no difference whether the mover of the being endowed with a soul is outside that being, as in the case of an animal fleeing from the heat of the sun, right? So there, it's something outside that makes the animal want to run, or be taking it to when it's thirsty to go where there's water. For an animal is moved also through imagining what disagrees and agrees with it. Now, the sphere is not set in motion with view to fleeing from what disagrees with it, or with the view seeking to attain what. When the sphere moves around, it moves away from the point towards which it had moved, and it moves towards every point from which it has moved away. So in other words, it's constantly moving round and round, away from where it started and back towards where it started. So if the motion were because of this, right, if the motion of the sphere was because it was running away from something or going towards something, it would follow necessarily that at some point it would come to rest. It would get there, or it would get away from where it wants to get away from. For if it was moved in order to seek to attain something or flee, right, then it would eventually achieve that achievement. I just turned the page to 256. In consequence, the circular motion must be, right, remember the Rambam is logically deducing this, because of a certain mental representation. Now, there is no mental representation without an intellect. If something's deciding to make the circle move, it has to be an intellect. Again, now remember, Rambam is speaking science now. He's not speaking Torah, right? He's going to speak Torah in a second, and then you'll understand why he's going through so much length to explain to us that these spheres have intellects, right? Again, not everyone who has an intellect with which he represents a certain notion or who has a soul is able to move. Do they move while representing something? Like I could think, I want to go get a glass of water and then decide not to go. So I could think to myself about getting water, but not actually go. Right? Mental representation alone doesn't necessitate motion, right? And I'm going to skip a couple sentences. But however, when you decide to move, in order to obtain what you are represented, when you decide I'm going to go get the glass, then you get up and do it. That's when your mental representation makes you go. Accordingly, it likewise is clear that the soul, in virtue of which there is motion, and the intellect, by which the object is represented to itself, are not both of them together sufficient to account for the coming of such emotion until desire from the notion is conjoined with them. In other words, the ability to move is not the same as actually deciding to move. Furthermore, it follows necessarily from this that the sphere has a desire for that which it represents itself, in which is the beloved object, namely the deity, right? Wait, give me 1 second. I want to say this a little bit more clearly. I kind of skipped a little bit. I skipped the sentence that was important, but the bottom line of what he's saying to the end of that really long paragraph on 256 is that ultimately what makes everything move, the deity that makes everything move, is an intellect, so to speak, right? Obviously not an intellect. Rambam emphasized this a million times, not an intellect like ours, but an entity that decides to make all of the spheres move. When all of this became clear to Aristotle, I'm at the little paragraph at the bottom of 256, he started to reflect again and found that it may be proved by demonstration that the spheres are many, and that the motion of one particular sphere differs from that of another regarding to swiftness or slowness. So then he looked into the cosmos and he sees that these spheres don't explain everything, because when you look up at the stars, within those stars you see different motions, right? So he was compelled to believe, right, that the notion represented to itself by one sphere, in consequence of which notion accommodates the movement swiftly in one day, is not the notion represented itself by another sphere, which accomplishes one movement in 30 years, because one of those stars moves from here to there in 30 years, and the other one moves from here to there in one day, right? So accordingly, he affirmed categorically that there exist separate intellects whose number is equal to that of the spheres. So every sphere desires the intellect that is its principle and is the mover causing it to move according to the movement proper to it. That's how he explained the movement of all the cosmos and all kinds of different things, by constantly adding new spheres. As you can imagine, all those new spheres get more and more and more complicated and more complicated, and eventually stop being reasonable explanations, which is why eventually Copernicus said this whole thing is ridiculous, and he came up with a completely new idea, right? But until that point, and in Rambam's point, there was still, each time they saw another star moving in another way, the way it was explained is either there's another sphere or there are spheres within the spheres that move. Okay, so neither Aristotle nor anyone else has affirmed categorically that the number is 10 or 100. However, whatever the number of spheres is, after we finish counting them all, Aristotle would say there is that amount of intellects that decide to move each sphere in the way that it moves. As it was thought in his time that there are 50. So therefore, there would be 50 separate intellects. And this is important, for in his time, there was little knowledge of mathematics, and the science had not been brought to perfection. This statement is in the article that I sent out today as a proof that Rambam understood that even in Aristotle's time, right, the mathematics and the science hadn't yet achieved the level that it had achieved by the time Maimonides was writing, at which they understood more about the spheres, right? It accordingly was thought that every motion requires a separate sphere. In Aristotle's day, every time they added a new sphere. But I'm going to make it short and skip and say that according to the Rambam, right, it's not a new, he didn't add a new sphere. He went down to the 10 original spheres, and he changed the movement by saying that within the spheres, there's other spheres. Okay, so with regard to the opinion of the later philosophers that there are 10 separate intellects, right? It may be the last sentence in the paragraph on 257. This is not a subject. I'm going off track, the Rambam says. So let's get back to the topic. So the later philosophers said that there's 10 separate intellects because they counted the globes in which there are stars as well as the all-encompassing sphere, right, which is the outermost one. Although in some, there are several spheres, like I explained before. That's how Maimonides explained it, and that's how in his time the scientists were explaining it. The globes are 9, according to their reckoning, namely the one that encompasses the universe, the sphere of the fixed stars, and then the 7 planets. And I described what the 7 planets are, the moon, the sun being the first 2 planets in their way it works. The 10th intellect, what is the intellect that runs the outer sphere? That's the active intellect, who's in capital, whose existence is indicated by the fact, right, that our intellects pass from potentiality to actuality. What makes it all move? This whole world can do things, but what makes it all happen? Right? It's the active intellect. It's the deity who decides to make everything move. Now, everything that passes, I'm going to skip a little bit, page 258. Let me skip to the second paragraph on page 258. In this connection, Aristotle deals further with the matter that has already been demonstrated, namely, that God, may he be magnified and held sublime, does not do things in a direct fashion. So when God does something in the world that you and I are living in, which is the bottommost, right? All the spheres revolve around us. We're in the middle of it all, right? He burns by means of a fire, right? Not by lighting the fire, but by acting through all of these spheres, right? Okay. So Rambam mentioned this a little bit in the first book as well. We had this together. So that when God makes things happen, he makes them happen through the physics, through the science, through the rules of physics and motion that were set in place. Okay, this is going to be all I'm going to say about this chapter 4. However, I want to summarize something because we're about to hit chapter 5, and we're going to see how all of a sudden the Rambam takes all of this science. And I want to emphasize again, the Rambam is giving us a physics lesson, right? He wants us to understand. So let's screw on our head and try to think as if we're living in his time. And then we're going to encounter the Torah thinking this is physics, right? I went to college. I got a university degree in physics. I now know that there's 10 spheres. The outermost, each sphere is controlled by an intellect because the intellect decides to make it move, okay? Right? Forget about atoms and E equals MC squared, and forget about space. Forget all the things that you and I know in 2023. This is not what they knew. They knew the Earth was the center of the world. The moon revolves in sphere number 1, the sun is sphere number 2, and so on and so forth, until God is running this all, is the active intellect that makes it all run. And through the motions of each outer sphere, the next sphere moves, the next sphere moves. And that's how all the elements in this world come to be, and all the interact, and we see everything that we see in front of us. Now that we understand that this is how it works, and that each of these spheres is controlled by an intellect, there's something that's deciding to move. Now let's look at the Torah, okay? And after we go through this exercise that the Rambam is going to do, you can sit down at home yourself and say, okay, now I'm in 2023. I'm going to take the physics and I know, and can I do the same mental exercise that the Rambam did, right? And make it work with the Torah. That'll be a challenge that we're all going to have, right? All of us are going to be challenged to do that. Okay, but first let's see how the Rambam does it with his understanding of physics. Okay, so chapter 5, page 259. As for the assertion that the spheres are living and rational, remember, this is the scientific view of the time, that the moon moving around is because there is a living rational intellect, right? That decides, I, the moon, am going to go around, right, in this pattern, right? I mean to say, endowed with apprehension. It is true and certain also from the point of view of the Torah, right? He translates Torah as law. I'm going to translate Torah as Torah, okay? They are not dead bodies similar to fire and earth, as is thought by the ignorant, right? The moon is not moving because it just does what it does like earth and fire. Remember, earth and fire's movement is because of their very nature in this scheme, in this physics, right? Earth falls to the ground because that's what earth does. It's nature. There's nothing deciding to make the earth. But the moon is moving, not because it's natural movement. It's moving because there's a, right? So, but they are, as the philosophers say, in other words, as the scientists say, right, living beings who obey their Lord and praise him and extol him greatly. They're doing what God created them to do, right? They're doing filling the rules that God made. Thus, the Torah says, the heavens tell of the glory of God, and so on. Now, I want you to think for a minute, right? I'm just going to give an example. So how do we know, right? When we look at the moon, why does the moon go around, right? So we know that there's gravitational forces, right? And there's inertia, right? The moon is moving forward and it orbits the earth, right? Because, so we talk about the force of gravity, right? The force of gravity is a constant within nature that Isaac Newton calculated how much what the value of the force of gravity is. And therefore the moon goes round and around and around. And so does everything else in the solar system and the galaxy and the universe, etc. Right? So in our science, it's not an intellect, right, that's making the moon go around, but it's the scientific constants, right? It's the physical forces that we have identified in modern physics that make the moon go around, okay? So now what does the Rambam do with his intellect, right? So he says like this, that intellect is telling us of the glory of God, right? Because it's doing what God told it to do. In the same way, you and I in 2023 will say that those forces of nature, right? And this is the crucial point. The forces of nature that makes the moon go around are telling us of the glory of God. So we can do the same exact thing that Rambam does with his intellects and apply it to 2023 modern physics. It's the incredible fact of gravity, and scientists have shown, like, if the constant of gravity was 1 iota different, either more or less than it is, the universe wouldn't exist as it does today, and life never would have come to be. But it's that very force of gravity, exactly as it is, that brought about the entire universe and tells us of the glory of God. How very remote from mental representation of the truth are those who think that this is language appropriate to the state of the speaker. For the terms speaking and telling are applied together in Hebrew only to a being endowed with intellect, right? In this case, they are telling this to us because there is a wisdom, Rambam says, that tells us something, right? The manifest proof of the fact that scripture decides their state according to their essence, right? I mean, to say the state of the spheres, not the state according to which people consider them as the dictum. There is no speech, there are no words, neither is their voice heard, okay? That's Tillim. It thus makes it clear and manifest that it describes the essence of the spheres as praising God and making known his wonders without speech of lip and tongue, right? Because there is a force making it move around, and that force tells us of the glory of God. And this is correct. For he who praises through speech only, right? You and I can praise someone through speech, or we can praise God through speech. but he only makes it known what he has represented to himself. Now, this very representation is the true praise, whereas the words concerning it are meant to instruct someone else, or to make it clear concerning oneself that one has had the apprehension in question. Thus it says, commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still, right? It's a famous verse from Psalms, right? As we have explained, we explained earlier in the first chapter, right? This is a proof based on the Torah that may be denied only by one who is ignorant or obstinate. As for the opinion of the sages concerning this, I do not think it requires to be explained or proved. I'm just going to tell you a few examples, Rambam says. Consider the way they arranged the blessing of the moon, right? As well as what is repeatedly stated in the prayers and the midrashim regarding the hosts of heaven worship you, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, right? So all of these celestial heavenly beings, so to speak, and I mean so to speak in literal sense, so to speak, as if they are telling us of the greatness of God when they do the actions that God created them to do, okay? When they say in Bereshis Rabbah, and the earth was tohu vavohu, it was mourning and crying, which means the earth cried woe and howled because of it. Said, I and they were created together, which means the earth and the heavens. Yet those above are alive and those below dead. They also have said explicitly that the heavens are living bodies and not dead ones like the elements, right? The heavens are like living bodies because they have intellects, right? Which control them and make them move. And nowadays we would change those words intellects and make them into forces. Thus it has become clear to you that what Aristotle said likewise with regard to the sphere being endowed with apprehension and mental representation corresponds very well with the Torah. All right, so here's Rambam explaining that what Aristotle said, this is really getting to the heart of the purpose of this book. Those that are perplexed at the contradiction between Aristotle, science, and Torah, Rambam is saying it's not a contradictory at all. His answer is that this is exactly what the Torah means when it says that the bodies of the heavens tell of the greatness of God. Know that there is a consensus of all the philosophers to the effect that the governance of this lower world is perfected by the means of the forces overflowing to it from the sphere, meaning the sphere above it, and that the spheres apprehend and know that which they govern. Okay, this is also expounded in the letter of the Torah, which says, which the Lord thy God hath allotted unto all peoples, which means that he made the spheres intermediaries for the governance of the created beings, and not with the view to their being worshipped. So it says clearly, and to rule over the day and over the night and to divide, meaning they have domination through governance. In other words, they have some sort of faculty, some sort of thinking faculty that makes them decide to do something. Now, it is absurd to assume that he who governs something should not know that thing which he governs. We shall speak at length about this subject elsewhere. I want to get to chapter 6. I'm just a little bit, just to introduce an idea that the Rambam is going to get into, that because this idea of intellects deciding to make the moon go around is something that doesn't work in modern physics. That was an idea of Aristotelian physics. So some of this we would have to kind of put away and say, well, this might have sounded good to Rambam, but it doesn't sound so good to us. But the next thing he's about to say about what angels are, you know what, I'm just going to give a little introduction, because the discussion of angels is going to be, is real important, and we're not going to be able to go through the whole thing. But the Rambam then states that when the Torah refers to angels, it's referring to those intellects, right, which are which make make the world go round, literally, right? In other words, angels are referring to a physical, real, created phenomenon, right? That God created when he created the moon, just like Aristotelian physics, and in the Rambam's mind, this was the truth, was proved that there are intellects that decide to make the moon go. Those intellects are angels. So it would be almost the same thing as someone today saying that if I told you the moon works and goes around because of gravity, right? Gravity is an angel. And think about that, because the angel is the force of nature that God created that makes things happen. So when we see the wind, and when we see the sea, and when we see the sun and the moon, those that are powered by forces of nature, what we're seeing are angels. So angels have left the realm of being a spiritual thing that we can't feel or touch to an actual physical thing that we can measure and grasp and describe with scientific rules. and he's going to explain that in more detail as we head into chapter 6. So I'm gonna stop here for this week's lecture and open the door for comments. But we're really getting into the meat now of the purpose of the book, of helping us perplexed people understand that science and Torah do not conflict, right? Anyway, I'm going to stop and I'm going to open the floor for any comments, questions, issues, etc. You can unmute yourself if you want to add something.
I have one comment. I came in late. I'm sorry, but I'm going to listen to you as soon as I see your link to the first half. What about the position that you're offering this in hindsight and the 21st century, and you're trying to, and others, similar scholars and great intellect, are trying to fit this into a proposition to reconcile? And if at this time you were to offer this somewhat modernized version of Aristotle, you're trying to fit things together for our own, but that's at least in his time would be a strain to embrace.
Yeah, I mean, I will admit and emphasize that obviously the way I suggested to apply modern physics to the Torah was just a suggestion based on how the Rambam applied his physics to the Torah, right? I'm not necessarily claiming that my suggestion is the correct one, or certainly not the only one. But the one thing that is clear that I think we have to draw from the Rambam, and that is very clear, is the Rambam refuses to say that what I know to be true from science is somehow wrong because the Torah contradicts it. The Rambam refuses to accept that, right? And instead of saying that, he says, if I know it to be true from science, right, then it has to be compatible with the Torah. And then he suggests how that can be done, right? And what the Rambam knew from science, what he was proven to him in his mind philosophically, was that there are intellects that make the moon go around, right? Or the sphere within which the moon is embedded goes around. Then that must comply when the Torah says that the heavenly bodies give praise to God, right? What does that mean? It means that the intellect which makes the heavenly bodies move, right, are giving praise to God. Now, you and I would say something else because our physics says nothing about some intellect that makes the moon go around, right? Our physics talks about the forces of gravity and so on and so forth. So our explanation of that verse is going to necessarily be different from the Rambam. Now you are just as qualified, and anyone listening and anyone else in the world is just as qualified as I am in making assumptions as to what the Rambam would have said or might have said, right? But one thing is clear, right? He definitely wants us to say that something that has been demonstrably shown to be true, right? And to the extent that we know, the science of today has demonstrably known to be true, right? That's not to say that in 10 years things might not change. I admit that also, right? I recognize that. But as of right now, this is what we know of to be true. I cannot say that somehow that contradicts the Torah. I must say that somehow this is what the Torah must have meant, right? And somehow it means so. And then what happens is, well, then you could say, well, last year so-and-so said this is what the Torah meant. And the year before, someone else said that's what the Torah meant. 100 years before, someone else said that's what the Torah. So what did really Torah mean? It really didn't mean anything. No, that's not the point. The point is the Torah meant it all, right? When the Torah said that the moon's motion, right, gives praise to God, it meant to tell you something that's been timeless this whole way through, that God is the creator of the universe. And whatever it is that makes the moon move, right, or shine, who knows, whatever it is, whatever scientific explanation you're going to have, that gives testimony and praise to God, the creator, right? And that's consistent, right? So I might call it gravity, and he might have called it an Aristotelean intellect, and Copernicus might have called it something else, right? But the bottom line is what that entity, right, gives praise to God because God created it, and the moon is doing what it does, right? And it's incredible because if it didn't do what it did, we wouldn't be here, right? Anyway, that's the real point that we have to draw from the Rambam, and that's why And I do recommend that article. I sent it out. It's easy to read. If it's very if I send it on the chat on WhatsApp, and if you don't have the WhatsApp, and you just send me your email address and I'll email it to you. But he shows conclusively, how Rambam understood the idea of the advancement of scientific knowledge. In case you doubt it, I think he does a really nice job proving that idea. Anyone else want to contribute or ask?
But I have a question about the
Yes.
the spheres. Would Rambam consider them to be pure intellect or disembodied intellect that were controlling the physical reality? Or
Yeah, there's some sort of intellect, right? How it was contained within those spheres or outside of those spheres is unclear. They seem to be like a disembodied intellect, because Rambam emphasized that they don't have to be within it, right? It could be from without it, right? So, but there's an intellect somewhere, and we don't know if there's even a physical location of this intellect, but some sort of intellect exists that makes the moon go around, right? And then there's an intellect that exists that makes the sun go around, which influences the intellect below it, which is the moon, right? And then there's an intellect above the sun, which is the intellect of Mercury, right, which makes Mercury go around. And the intellect above that is whatever, you keep going, Venus, and then Mars, and then Jupiter and Saturn, right? So, and each sphere is making the one below, and there's somewhere an intellect making it happen. You're going to see how this is important for a lot of things. We need to understand this, even though, and I know I said this a million times, but this is Rambam's scientific understanding. This is how he and Aristotle and all of the great thinkers of the day understood the universe scientifically. So when the Rambam is going to explain to us the idea of prophecy, right? And he's going to tell us that prophecy is when one perfects his intellect, that he's able to somehow connect to those intellects that are above the level of humanity, right? The Rambam will describe it as connecting to these intellects that we're talking about, right? And somehow being able to perceive what those intellects perceive. What the Rambam is explaining when he says that is a scientific explanation of philosophy. Does that make sense? So obviously there's going to be a lot more depth to this discussion as we get into it, but it's going to make a big difference to how you understand what prophecy is. There are some incredibly beautiful examples of how the Rambam's understanding of philosophy of prophecy affect the way you understand the prophecies of the Torah, and how the Rambam uses it to answer things that are otherwise huge conundrums. I'm thinking about leaving a teaser here about the story of the Akedat Yitzchak, right? Which is one of the most difficult to understand stories in the Torah, and how using Maimonidean understanding of what prophecy is, right? That maybe not all, but many of the questions that surround the story of the Akedah start to make a lot more sense. I'll put it out there. There's a writer who you might want to look into his books. His name is Kenneth Zieskin. That's Seeskin. He's a philosophy professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. Seeskin. He wrote a book called Thinking About the Torah, and another book called Thinking About the Prophets. And he also wrote, I have sitting in front of me because I just got it today, Maimonides, A Guide for Today's Perplexed, which is like somewhat of a guide to how to read Maimonides. And he wrote several other books that I really enjoyed. But he goes through a Maimonidean understanding of the Akedah using his understanding of prophecy, right? Which is just absolutely beautiful. And it's so beautiful that you'll never see the Akedah in the same way again. Right. I want to leave it as a little teaser, but maybe I'll throw it out there next time. But it's worth looking at his books. You can get them anywhere. Kenneth Zieskin is his name. He makes deep philosophical principles accessible to people that don't have PhDs in philosophy. And it's very, very well done. Yeah, so understand. So these intellects are going to be an important factor in how Rambam explains lots of things. So just be ready for that. And then I'm going to, at many occasions, I'm going to stand back and say, well, what do we do today when we don't, when these intellects aren't scientifically valid ideas anymore, right? So, and like I suggested today, I'm going to point out what is important to learn from the Rambam. And I guess if I'm going to reiterate one more time, is the idea that the truth of science, which is demonstrably true, remains true, right? And then the Torah, when it refers to these ideas, is referring to the truths of science. It's referring to the truths of the measurable universe. I was talking with Billy Marsala a couple of days ago, and she's here in the class today, about the difference between mysticism and Maimonidean rationalism. And I think if you wanted to sum it up in one statement, right, and I'm not here to take sides, I'm just here to demonstrate the difference between the sides, is mysticism is the idea that there are immeasurable, spiritually inaccessible things that can't be described in scientific physiological terms, right, which we tap into when we either worship or pray or somehow access the spirituality that exists in this world. A Maimonidean rationalist explains everything in the Torah with physical, measurable, actual things, right? In other words, the Rambam, when he wants to know what an angel is, he opens up a physics textbook, right? I mean, it's not a physics textbook printed in the year 1162, not one printed in 2023. But that's how he accesses what an angel is, right? When he wants to understand what a prophecy is, he does that as well, right? And of course, obviously, he learns the Torah, and then he sees, how does this work? How does one match up with the other? And that is the point that I wanted to make from these two chapters we just read together. And next week, we're going to learn about angels, and it'll be a very different understanding of what some of you may have thought angels were, right? So, and I already gave a little intro as to what Rambam is going to do, how he describes angels. We still have a little bit longer if anyone has more questions before I close up for the night.
I would just close with a comment of a scientist, a professor, said, if it's inaccessible, it doesn't have evidentiary support, cannot be evidentiary verified. That's not science, and you shouldn't even raise the question because it's inaccessible. And so what we're hearing here is redefining science as he sees it, because he'll say, for example, what preceded God, or the creation of the universe. He said it's not accessible, so it's not science, so I can't even address it. And what I see here is a redefinition of the term science.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point. And when we're talking about God, we're not talking about science anymore, because God is inaccessible. Science is something that a human being, by definition, can measure, can describe, can apply laws or derive laws from, right? God is something that we can't. And that's the difference between physics and metaphysics, Masa Bereshis and Masa Merkava. And
so it's not a reconciliation process. It's a division process that he advocates.
That's definitely one good way of looking at it. I mean, there are definitely places where he's trying to make the two jive, right? And places where he makes an absolute division when he says that God cannot be accessed by a human intellect, right? Whereas anything else can be. All right. I think that'll close for the evening. I'm looking forward to, God willing, to next week. So next week we learn again. And then I think the week after is the week of Tisha B'Av, right? The 26th we will skip because it's Tisha B'Av night. But next week, Mir Hashem, the 19th, barring any emergencies on my end, we should be fine. All right. Be well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.